So, theocracy and empire. My dad, a humanist and assertive atheist, had a long time habit of listening to people who had other religious and political beliefs. He would invite, for instance, door to door proselytizers into the house, serve them coffee, and have a long discussion of them, continuing it as long as he could, figuring he was protecting other people who might otherwise be vulnerable, who they might have visited during that time. Not unlike his habit of visiting the John Birch Society office where in the city where he lived and taking as much free literature as they would give him. He was very happy to waste their money and also to read their literature to find out what they were really about. He would get on the weirdest mailing lists just to use up their resources as he saw it. And of course, that was before email. And so I was able from a fairly young age to read some of the material of fringe political and religious groups directly, to read what they sent to their own followers. For instance, the Christian identity movement, which teaches that only Nordic and Celtic people are really the Israelis of the Bible, and that the rest of the world should be subjugated or exterminated. I've long paid attention to the agenda of those whose vision of empire would mean suppression of much of what I value. Excuse me a sec. Theocracy has a long history in this land. Most of us learned a story of the Pilgrims coming to America to escape political and religious persecution, but we often didn't learn that they did this in order to establish, in what they saw as a wilderness, their own religiously exclusive community. The indigenous people who didn't own land and have stable cities, obviously the Pilgrims felt could just move along somewhere else and sometimes be pushed away with violence. The Puritans and Pilgrims were Calvinists, named for John Calvin. Religiously, the Calvinists are known primarily for their belief in predestination, but Calvinists were also unified by their belief in theocracy, that the state should be controlled by the church. Of all the various British colonies in North America that became the United States, the two largest states, with well over half the US population, still had established churches at the time of the Declaration of Independence. In Virginia, it was the Episcopal Church. Thomas Jefferson introduced a bill to disestablish the church in 1779, but it was opposed actively by members of the church, and it did not pass until 1786. The last established church in the states that was able to be disestablished was in Massachusetts in 1833. The Congregationalists, heirs of the Pilgrims, had moved away by that time from Calvinism and had become Unitarian. But it really wasn't until the 14th Amendment that the prohibition of establishing churches was extended legally to the states. Now, you may have learned the story of Roger Williams, that religious heretic from Massachusetts who founded the state of Rhode Island and who promoted the idea of individual religious liberty. And you may have heard of Anne Hutchinson and Mary Dyer, arrested and banned from Massachusetts for teaching Christian doctrines that were different from those of the local hierarchy. Mary Dyer was finally hanged in Boston when she refused to obey her banishment. Within the last decade, the state of Texas tried to remove Anne Hutchinson's story from history standards. And why? Because, as they said, her only contribution to history was resisting religious authority. And of course, we don't want to teach children about that. And how about Pennsylvania? We think of the Quakers as very different. Quakers had not been very welcome in either Massachusetts or Virginia, established their own realm. As for religious freedom, William Penn's 1681 Constitution read, "Whatever is Christian is legal, whatever is not is illegal." And then there's Maryland. Maryland protected Roman Catholics who were given the British authority for settling that area in the middle of surrounding Protestant cultures. And that led Maryland to decide to establish no church and protect individual religious choice to avoid conflict. At the time of the settlers and colonists separating from British rule, many trying to unify the colonies to stand against the English authority understood that each of these different groups of theocrats, and in one case, people for religious freedom, would want their own state to have its identity religiously and would want their situation to be made the federal situation, which would lead to conflict and disunity and probably a collapse of the effort to separate from the British. So religious freedom was included in the Bill of Rights, without which some states would not ratify the Constitution. James Madison said that this was a practical matter in the interest of unity and peace. In his memoirs, Madison wrote, "Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects?" But until the 14th Amendment, that didn't apply to states. From the beginning, these United States had a dual direction. On the one hand, seeking to protect one's community and individual rights to worship. And on the other, the right of a religious community to hold sway in a geographic area, expelling or even executing those who disagreed. Since the more recent rise in the Muslim world of an anti-modern theocratic rule in Iran and elsewhere, it has become almost a habit for those in the US to focus on Islam and Sharia law when we talk about theocracy. But as they say in the horror movies, the threat is inside the house. Theocratic ideas rooted in Christianity, with many more followers than theocratic Islam in this country. And I don't think, by the way, it's a good idea to call these people the Christian Taliban or their theocratic ideas as it's another Sharia rule, as if the real danger is the Muslim form of theocracy. Christian theocrats are not simply an imitation of Muslim theocracies. I also want to make clear, I'm not talking here about general conservatism or about all Christians, not even all fundamentalists or evangelical Christians, and certainly not just people in those groups. One can find theocratic Christians within the Presbyterian Church and the Episcopal Church in America, and many other denominations. More quietly among Roman Catholics, who remember that many of their now political allies on issues like abortion used to fear the Catholics establishing that church. Fringe groups like Christian Identity are included, but theocracy is not limited to fringe groups. The theocrats in America from the 1960s began, however, I think it's important to recognize, they began to target one political party as more friendly to their presence and ideas, and vice versa. Theocratic religious people saw one party as a way to further their theocratic aims. And the then extremist wing of the party saw an opportunity to expand the party beyond its image as an elite blue blood country club group of people. It was a deliberate and pragmatic partnership. Now, back in 2007, I first spoke on this topic from an ethical culture platform. And much of what I predicted at that time has become real, maybe a little bit different than I thought, and a whole lot sooner. And maybe more are aware of it now. Kristen Lems wrote that song about theocracy in the 1980s, seeing the progress of a political and religious partnership. I have been thinking about it since our history teacher in high school was very clear that the first colonies were more theocratically oriented than you would think from our celebration of pilgrims as heroes of religious freedom. And again, in the 70s and 80s, I watched white supremacy fringe groups and some white evangelicals become less distinguishable from each other and aligning with the political right. And thanks to my dad, I actually read their own internal literature. Some definitions. By theocracy, what the proponents mean is a state or nation under the control of God, where decisions are made by measuring whether that is in accord with the will of God, not the will of the voters, not comparing it to some document that is somehow thought to be superior to the Bible, because to the theocrats, the Bible is the superior document. That's why, by the way, that under God was added to in the 1950s to the Pledge of Allegiance. The ideal is that the US government was to be a government of law, not of men, after the experience of political rule of kings. But the Christian theocrats see the need for a government of God, not of men, with law serving God and Christ as king. I think the flaw in this should be obvious. It isn't to the practitioners. It is that men, and in this case I do mean mostly men, who interpret the law and will of God. The theocrat will disagree, pointing to a Bible that they believe can be interpreted literally. But even biblical literalists will among themselves disagree on which verses are to be interpreted metaphorically. For instance, how literally is the term day meant in the first verses of the book of Genesis? Fundamentalism is one attempt to come to consensus among Christians on what biblical-based religious principles really are. Between 1910 and 1915, a series of pamphlets were published on the, quote, fundamentals, and that's where the term fundamentalist comes from. Today, 30 million or more Americans adhere to fundamentalism. Fundamentalism denies that its principles are subject to analysis or criticism. It rejects Enlightenment rationalism, and it is suspicious of decision-making through participative democracy. But it is happy to embrace modern technology and techniques where they serve to further the goals of the movement. Fundamentalism is not the same as evangelical Christianity, although there's an overlap. Evangelicalism means simply putting at the center the so-called Great Commandment to bring the good news of Jesus's resurrection to the wider world. If one's view of Christianity is a liberal one can still be an evangelical. But many of evangelicals today, especially white evangelicals, are fundamentalists. And when you combine fundamentalist beliefs with a belief that there's a commandment to bring those beliefs to more and more people, the tendency is to move into realms where power and influence are greatest, that is, mass media and the government. Add that to the fear of demographic change and losing power, and you get a white supremacist theocratic vision. Now, around the same time that fundamentalism was taking shape, in Europe, another movement was beginning in the Netherlands. A prime minister there converted to a Calvinist form of Christianity and attempted to establish that Christianity in the Netherlands through his political power. This idea then moved to America, where it was taken up most notably by the minister and religious writer R.J. Rushdoony. His first book was on what he saw as the attempt through public school systems to enforce secular humanism. He was advocating for a system of Christian homeschooling instead. He moved from there to a more general defense of Christianity as the whole basis of American society, notably claiming that the First Amendment was meant not to protect individual freedom of belief, but to protect the right of states to establish their own churches. Rushdoony's most influential book was The Institutes of Biblical Law, modeled on a book by Calvin. This book advocated for Christian theocracy in America and also laid out strategies for moving America in that direction. He moved beyond his European mentor's roots to also write about a vision for the economic system that he saw as essential to American theocracy, what he called Christian libertarianism. This system is called Reconstructionist Christianity. The fruits of Rushduni's work are apparent in many churches today, and they're apparent in deliberate influence on the American political system and the attempt to move that toward Rushduni's vision of a theocratic society. As just one small example, I will point out that Ted Cruz's father is a Reconstructionist minister. There are others outside the relatively small numbers of strict adherents to Reconstructionism who also share many of the same principles or are moving in that direction. So although the United States formally sort of rejected the idea of theocracy in favor of religious tolerance, today there's a move towards religious tolerance and a deliberate, intentional religious intolerance. A move toward theocracy and intolerance. The actual number of people in this country who adhere to explicitly theocratic ideas is something like 22% of the population. That's bad enough, but it's actually more like 50% of the Senate and 49% of the House who can be counted on to vote as the theocrats want. And now the majority of the Supreme Court is comprised of people associated with religious ideas that we would call theocratic. Theocrats know how to organize and vote for their views, and that work is decades and decades long. For those of us who don't share Christian theocracy's tenets, this goal of taking over the government and shaping its laws to favor and reinforce fundamentalism is something we cannot ignore. Most of us share a belief in religious diversity and individual freedom of belief. The irony of that belief in toleration is that if we are merely tolerant of and neutral towards theocracy, we may have a self-destructive belief. There are limits to any tolerance, and that limit, I believe, is intolerance. One cannot tolerate intolerance and have tolerance survive. If we do not oppose theocracy, theocracy will prevail. So what are some of the basic goals of Christian theocracy that we need to know for self-protection and for the advancement of the kind of world we'd like to see? And I'm going to go through a number of these. One, the most basic to the theocrats, I believe, is a basic worldview that sees polarities, but no continuity between them. Black and white and no gray. There is no continuum of opinion. Battles are between good and evil, God and the devil. Anything that is not in total accord with their religious teachings is godless, immoral, and corrupt. There is no middle ground and no tolerance at all for the opposite pole. The second is that the theocrat wants no protection for individual religious liberty, and it wants no prohibition of the government promoting what they think is the only right religion. One Presbyterian pastor of a church with over 9,000 members and a key theocracy proponent called the wall of separation of church and state diabolical. Religious freedom to him is the work of the devil. So number 3, biblical law. That is, the theocrats want law in the United States brought into accord with what they see as biblical law. Well, they don't directly answer usually when you ask if that means the death penalty for disobeying your parents. They often focus publicly more on symbolism, like getting the 10 commandments in the courthouse and the school building. That is critically important in their view. That there are different versions of the 10 commandments doesn't bother them. They usually choose the Protestant version, of course. And they sometimes even edit out in public displays the part about not coveting your neighbor's slaves. And you might guess why they edit that out. This centrality of biblical law also clarifies a seeming contradiction in politics. Those who claim to be for less government, especially federal government, seek more and more state and federal regulation of certain areas of life. But these are areas where theocratic ideas teach that the government should be active. It's actually not a contradiction. It is very consistent with the theocratic worldview. So number 4, they oppose laws which they believe are against what the Bible teaches. One key Bible teaching they point to is what they think is the only proper organization of the family. Father and husband as head of and provider for the family, wife and mother having and raising children under direction of the husband, never working outside the home. The submission of children to the authority of their parents, women to the authority of their husbands, and the submission of men to the authority of their ministers in the church, that is an important part of the theocratic vision. And 5th, sexuality. In a theocratic view of biblical law, the only function of sex is procreation. No abortion, no contraception. Now, this stance is in some ways ironic because contradictory to the public image of our historical Puritans, the Puritans actually found a lot of sexual delight within marriage, and it was not only accepted, but promoted and celebrated. That's why they had often 20 children. The teaching of the Roman Catholic Church about sex as only reluctantly acceptable for the purpose only of procreation, and by the way, that's a teaching which was rejected by the Protestant Reformation. That Roman Catholic teaching is now part of a lot of Protestant fundamentalism. And related to that is opposition to any government tolerance of homosexuality or gender nonconformance. It's an illustration of how the theocrats rely on their interpretation of biblical law. The Bible makes other behavior equally anathema, yet theocrats don't prohibit wearing clothes they don't prohibit wearing clothes made of mixed fabrics, and they don't prohibit the wearing of braids. So number 6, the only good marriage is a heterosexual marriage of one man and one woman. We've heard that a lot in politics in recent years. They call this biblical marriage, rejecting the evidence of polygamy in the Bible. They connect this to that idea of sex only being for procreation, but it's not completely connected because they don't prohibit postmenopausal women or infertile people from being married. So that's clearly not their whole reasoning. So number 7, abortion, contraception, and other reproductive rights for individual women and people who can get pregnant are opposed. While the right to life and the personhood of the zygote, embryo, and fetus are their common arguments, Pat Robertson had no difficulty saying he would be for abortion in China. So there is actually more to this story if you really look into it. I tend to believe that it's more about controlling women's reproductive life than it is about the personhood of the fetus. In the 20th century, we know, I hope, the story where the Commonwealth of Virginia practiced forced sterilization of girls on a very large scale. Often girls whose only, quote, mental illness was that they willingly had sex without being married. If the state can forbid abortion and contraception, it also has the power to enforce sterilization. Number 8, another key plank in the theocracy platform is the idea that the church should dispense charity, not the state. Thus, theocrats will try to dismantle any state-funded welfare program or try to turn the funding of such programs over to the churches, which will do a, quote, proper job of it, which means only giving charity to those poor who deserve it. Theocrats are fond of a quote from St. Paul: "They who would not work will not eat." Theocrats also, it's in their own internal literature, support massive tax cuts because that makes it more difficult for governments at all levels to provide assistance programs. Don't assume tax cuts for these folks are just about giving money to the wealthy. The cuts are also explicitly motivated by a desire to make it difficult to fund social support programs. And add to that the increased funding of faith-based programming. And in case you're wondering, Most of that money for faith-based programming goes to more theocratically oriented Christian faiths. Very little goes to non-Christians. And ninth, generally theocrats oppose a secular society and believe that secular humanism is perhaps one of the greatest evils to be fought and must be excluded from government. Tim LaHaye, more famous for his end times fiction, wrote in a book in 2000, "No humanist is fit to hold office." And number 10, along with this opposition to secular society goes a tendency to see themselves as victims in a secular society. I have seen Christian tracts which portray the secular world as planning to torture and kill all Christians. This is what they show to their children as what secular humanism is about. This victim mentality is carefully nurtured and taught. And ironically, they draw on the American ideology of freedom by portraying Christians as not having free speech and therefore as victims. Thus, we regularly get proposed laws to give free speech back to the churches, which actually means changing a law such that churches could raise money for candidates outside of the current reporting system and still maintain their tax-exempt status. And number 11, the theocrats see public schools as instruments of secular humanism, and so they fight a three-pronged attack on the schools. And the first attack on the schools is a direct battle to get schools to reinforce their religious beliefs and to remove from the curriculum any elements they believe incompatible with biblical law. So for instance, books with an open attitude towards sexuality or gender, or about evolution, which does not match their literal reading of the Bible. I once heard a theocratic preacher proposing that we do teach more Black history in the schools, by which he meant that school children should be taught that one of Jesus's disciples was Black. They also want to remove any teachings of tolerance or anything implying a moral foundation in human choice and not in the Bible. Thus, today, they oppose the teaching of social emotional skills. They particularly oppose any use of educational or childhood development theory, which conflicts with the authoritarian worldview of the theocrats. Okay, and the second thing they do with public schools is they are attempting to disestablish them through reducing tax money available to them. And they have many allies in this beyond theocratic groups. And third, they attempt to get their own adherents into either religious schools that they run or into homeschooling. You know, Christian schooling has this advantage, and sometimes they're explicit about this. It also reinforces parental authority over children, and it makes it much more difficult for mothers, who are usually the ones who are implementing the homeschool curriculum that's directed by their church and overseen by the husband. Makes it difficult for the mother to hold any outside jobs. So that's their plan for public schools. And 12th, economics. Rushdoony linked an economic ideology to the Christian ideology. Taxes, he says, are bad because they're not biblical. Well, except for sales taxes, although I can't find that in the Bible either. The theocrats want to dismantle the IRS and most forms of taxes. Property taxes they call theft, and income tax idolatry. Corporate power is not seen as a problem. And conveniently, the programs which reduce taxes for corporations and the wealthy tap into some traditional conservative values, so the theocrats are able to build a larger coalition on some of these issues. And 13, theocrats are opposed to most scientific knowledge. One of those is about climate change. You would think that they could see the climate emergency as evidence of end-time chaos predicted in the Bible. But their approach is we should accept God's will and not interfere with the coming of the end times. And a sense they also have that those end times are coming soon. So climate change would be a good thing to the Christian theocrats. So no wonder they oppose stopping it. And in general, a skepticism of science as another expression of that evil secularism. And 14, in 2007, I warned when I spoke that theocrats would support stronger judicial power where they control the courts by a long plan for gaining more control of the courts by appointments, and that they would oppose judicial power where it interferes with the ability to pass or enforce laws that are aligned with the theocracy's agenda. Thus, states can't pass laws about guns, but they can about abortion. Before the Supreme Court decision that legalized marriage equality, the theocrats wanted to pass a federal law to exclude marriage law from court review. And now that their opponents want a national law to exempt abortion from court review, the theocrats oppose those attempts. So the theocrats, as part of understanding that all of this is a very long process, a number of years ago founded several law schools explicitly to prepare people to be in place to get judgeships and other positions of power. These were schools which teach that the Bible's laws are superior to man's law. During the years 2001 to 2009, having graduated from one of those law schools was a very significant plus and maybe a requirement on one's resume to get a job in the Department of Justice. And those appointed with that preference are still, in many of them, in place and are protected by civil service from being fired just for that reason. So number 15, more and more the theocratic churches, which are mostly or all white in membership, also buy into a biblical hierarchy of who matters. No, they're not all believers in fringe groups like Christian Identity are, that white Europeans are the real people of Israel, but they adopt some of the same racial ideas. The fear of replacement by other demographic groups in the US is a growing tendency common in the same churches that preach theocracy. And 16, and finally, foreign policy. The theocrats see the US as the new biblical Israel, a nation chosen by God to rule the earth for God. This is called American exceptionalism. In foreign policy, theocracy tends to shape decisions to do three things. A, to allow for the expansion of Israel and its influence in the Middle East. This is based not on a great love of the Jewish people, but it's based on Christian end-time prophecies in which the theocrats believe it's important to require Israel to exist. Otherwise, the end times can't happen. So make no mistake, this kind of support for Israel's expansion is not from a love of the Jewish people. The Christian theocratic movement is deeply anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic. Jews, they believe, are not going to heaven, so they are irrelevant, except that there have to be Jews around to die in the last days. That's their main job in the world, in Israel, to the Christian theocrat. And B, just as the theocrats believe in the dominion of God over the US, they also believe in the dominion of the US over the world, so they can establish their version of Christianity worldwide. In 2003, some of us who are older might remember when Vice President Dick Cheney sent out official Christmas cards with this verse on it. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? He raised the image of a God-supported empire, and that was not an accident. And the third aspect of foreign policy, theocrats define, if they use the term at all, democracy in the rest of the world in a couple of ways. It's either, is it possible for the US to exert influence over that country? Or is it possible for US economic interests to operate freely in the country? Or is it possible for fundamentalist and evangelical Christians, especially the theocratic bent, to evangelize in that country. In other words, they use the language of democracy when what they really mean is US Christian theocratic empire being allowed to expand. And that view of empire is not an add-on, although I've come to it at the end of my list. Empire is central. To quote a promoter of theocracy, Charles Colson, if Christ is king, he is king over all, king of kings. Despite how much the biblical Jesus opposed the Roman Empire, the theocratic interpretation of the Bible calls for a new empire, a Christian empire. It also happens to be a white empire, since the vast majority of churches that promote this form of conservative theocracy are white in their membership. And believing that white people should rule is, by definition, a form of white supremacy. So it is white Christian empire. To quote Bill Moyers from a 1980s documentary on the topic of Reconstructionism, one of the key theocratic movements, there is no estimate of their numbers. They're not a formal organized group, not a cult or sect hiding away in the backcountry. There is no hierarchy or headquarters. Their leaders include learned scholars, articulate speakers, and prolific writers. They represent a cross-section. They disagree on many things, but on this they agree. Every area of American life, law, medicine, media, the arts, business, education, and the civil government must one day be brought under the rule of the righteous. Every area of life. And eventually to be brought beyond this nation to a worldwide godly empire. You know, events in Russia today show how theocracy is actually a worldwide tendency, although I doubt that the Russians think that the US churches are going to be in charge in the end. For instance, today, and I do mean today, meaning this year, Russian Orthodox priests in this country often get printed instructions of what they are to preach about in support of policies of Putin's government. I said back in 2007 when I talked on this topic that the promotion of theocratic ideas would result more and more in a nation torn apart and divided. Polarization is built in as a natural and inevitable consequence of an ideology of good versus evil. Who is evil will continue to be widened, and who is good narrowed to a select few considered the real inheritors of God's empire on earth. As a nation, we learned many hard lessons of the dangers of one religious group having authority over others. What Christian theocrats today often forget, or want their followers to forget, is that theocracy will just as likely lead to conflict between Christian groups as it will to Christian empire. I think here of a topic not taught in most schools, the Philadelphia Bible riots or prayer riots of 1844. The public schools at that time in Philadelphia taught religious studies as a mandatory topic, and they used a Protestant Bible. But more and more Roman Catholics had been immigrating to the United States, and in Philadelphia, some of them asked to be able to use a Catholic-approved Bible when the students in a class were majority Catholic. Well, what was the result of that? Riots. Over 3 days, and then another couple months later, another 2 days of riots. Anti-Catholic riots. 2 Catholic churches, 30 homes, and a fire station were burned down, with damage to many more buildings. At least 29 people were killed, more than 100 injured, and thousands had to flee their homes, all over which Bible to use in the public school. Theocracy, I believe, is dangerous, not just to those of us who aren't part of the religion that's established, but those who disagree in any small way. It's a danger to the ability of the nation to address any of its pressing problems like climate change. It's a future of even sects within the theocratic coalition eventually fighting each other for control of the state, or the one in control suppressing those who disagree, even past allies. Theocrats are a loose coalition, and turning on each other is a natural and predictable outcome once they make it possible to have power. Theocracy was rejected in this nation primarily on pragmatic grounds. Sometimes our temptation, if we believe in religious liberty and free speech, is to tolerate all actions in the name of religion, even those that may end up destroying the reality of religious liberty or free speech for some. I think we need to oppose both theocracy itself and its various agendas, including empire, which is a metaphor that pervades theocracy, an empire of hierarchical control, where voting is not how decisions get made, where democratic decision-making is not how economic decisions are made, where legislatures and courts enforce ideas of biblical law above any secular understandings of law. Well, I've talked mostly today about what theocracy is and its concept of empire and its goals, and not so much about how we resist. There are many, but I think it first takes being able to understand how deep the threat is. Will we resist theocracy and empire? Understanding that these are not just differences of opinion, but different ways of organizing power and control from, I think, the vision that most of us share. Yes, we've had a very imperfect democracy here, with forward movement sometimes and backsliding others, but it's been mostly a sharp contrast to complete empire and theocracy. Well, I'm going to right now invite those who are watching this video later to check us out live on a Sunday morning, either via Zoom or in person. You can find us at rysec.org.